All right, so today we're taking a closer look at NAFTA, or the North American Free Trade Agreement. So on December 8th, 1993, President Bill Clinton signs the North American Free Trade Agreement, also known as NAFTA, the Implementation Act, into law. The agreement eliminated trade barriers such as tariffs and import quotas. So no more tariffs, no more import quotas, meaning a regulation in terms of how much we can import into this country, and increased investments among Canada, Mexico, and the United States. So this is an agreement between Canada, Mexico, and the U.S. NAFTA aimed to make the exchange of goods and capital among the three countries easier. That's sort of the point. It is basically kind of a European economic community for North America. That's the idea, is to make exchange of goods and capital easier. So NAFTA was part of a broader trend in the late 20th century of governments making international trade dramatically easier or, quote, freer. This marked a change from the previous economic policies of many world powers, including the U.S., which used trade barriers to protect their own domestic producers. International free trade is the economic part of globalization. So all of this is part of what's called globalization. Basically, the idea behind globalization is making the world smaller and more economically connected. That's essentially what globalization is, making the world more economically interconnected. And there are opponents and supporters of globalizations that you'll find on both sides of the aisle. So Canada, Mexico, and the U.S. had been negotiating the treaty for several years before it was signed in 1993. George H.W. Bush, Mexican President Carlos Salinas, and Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulroney initially agreed to the treaty in 1992. So here we've got H.W., we've got, Carlos Salinas from Mexico, and then Brian Mulroney here from Canada. And they're, signing initially the draft of NAFTA in 1992. So it was drafted by a Republican president. Just throwing that out there. So the ratification process was extraordinarily contentious in the United States. The U.S., in order to gain support for NAFTA in Congress, Clinton pushed for two supplemental agreements. So Clinton's going to push for two additional sort of supplements to the actual treaty itself. So first, North American Agreement on Labor Cooperation. So the first one is for labor cooperation, meaning having to do with workers. And then second, the North American Agreement on Environmental Cooperation. So one for protection of workers, one for the protection of the environment. The Labor Cooperation Agreement added protection for workers in Canada, Mexico, and the United States by creating labor standards. And then the Environmental Cooperation Agreement outlined principles for environmental protection and conservation. So there were two additional supplements added by Clinton, and he was basically trying to get support in Congress by doing that. So after months of debate in Congress and, of course, across the country, the House of Representatives passed the agreement in November of 1993. The Senate passed it 3 days later. The debate over NAFTA crossed political party lines. In the House of Representatives, you have 132 Republicans voting in favor for it, 43 voting against. And in the Senate, you have Republicans voting in favor of it, 34 of them voting in favor of it, and 10 against. And then Democrats voting in favor of NAFTA in the Senate, and 28 opposed it. 27 Democrats voted in favor of NAFTA in the Senate, and 28 opposed it. And then in the House of Representatives, 102 Democrats voted against it, and 102 Democrats supported it, and 156 voted against it. So Republicans voted in favor for it, and Democrats, voted against it. So our central historical question here is looking back at 1993 to examine various arguments and perspectives on NAFTA in order to address the central historical question. So what are the arguments in the United States against ratifying NAFTA? Why was it so contentious? Why were people so butthurt about this agreement? So first we're going to be looking at Bill Clinton. So we're going to look at the three politicians that you're going to look at represent some of the major political positions from the debate on the U.S. over NAFTA. First, you've got a speech from Bill Clinton. As you read the speech, think about what evidence it provides about the arguments in the U.S. against NAFTA. Then you're looking at Nader. Ralph Nader is a lifelong, he's what we call a, there we go. He's what we call a consumer advocate, meaning he's someone who looks out for people who are going to be buying the goods that are going to be brought in by this agreement. And he's not affiliated with a political party. He's a politically independent. He's an independent, but he leans liberal. For decades, he advocated for consumer and labor rights and attacked the role of corporations in American politics. He initially rose to prominence in the 1960s with the publication of Unsafe at Any Speed, a book that criticized the safety record of American auto manufacturers. And he was subsequently involved in a series of efforts to protect consumers and the environment. So consumer advocate, environmental advocate, he's kind of he's all over the place, Ralph Nader. He ran for president like 50 times. He obviously lost all the times, but he just kept running. And then last, but certainly not least, is Pat Buchanan, who is a very long-time conservative commentator, and he is columnist, Republican politician. He was a senior advisor for Nixon, so his closest association is Nixon, so that tells you a lot about him immediately. Also for Ford and also for Reagan. So he served in the Nixon, Ford, and Reagan administration. So again, that tells you a lot about him. He identifies himself as what we call a member of the populist right. So think of the populists from the late 1800s and switch them to the other end of the political spectrum. The populists in the late 1800s would have been considered Democrats would have been considered Democrats by today's standards. Pat Buchanan identifies himself as a populist right, which is generally more conservative than the mainstream Republican Party. Buchanan has opposed increased immigration and free trade. He also expressed concern about the possibility of a, quote, new world order made up of international organizations that will take over individual nations and oppose authoritarian rule. So basically, he's worried about, U.S. sovereignty being taken away. That's one of his arguments. At the end of the day, it comes down to racism, but that's what he's going to argue. So those are the three people you're looking at: Clinton, Nader, and Buchanan. And once again, our central historical question is, why was the ratification of NAFTA so contentious?